Austin, Texas, a work hard, play hard kind of town, and the perfect fit for 30-year-old Trishelle Green. Recently single, she's here to start a new job and a new life.
She grew up in Dallas area, a blonde with a great smile. Nice figure, slim, whole 9 yards. She married and had 2 sons. They had divorced.
Can I get a...
I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and I'm gonna guess that this is the first time that you've had to buy your own drink.
It's the perfect chance for Brian Allen to move in.
Lucky for you, I'm here.
She immediately caught his eye.
What can I get you?
Whiskey neat, if you please. Make it a double.
Well, my kind of gal.
He thought she was just the most beautiful thing ever walked.
Brian was tall, dark, and handsome. He also had a very boyish face, a kind face.
You know, he was just a mountain of a man, for sure.
You should know, I have 2 kids.
Well, that just tells me that you make love like a champ.
That's right.
They were strongly attracted to each other.
That looks like it's our cue to go home.
Let's get out of here.
Wait, hold on. Before we go, I just want to get this out of the way.
They started dating after that.
Trishelle and her 2 boys moved to Brian's hometown, an hour outside of Austin.
Bertram was a very small town, very close-knit community. Just a great place to grow up, actually.
Brian's father lived on the same tract of land that Brian did.
Not too bad for an old man.
He had been the chief deputy sheriff of Burnett County, so Brian had strong ties to this community.
All right, Hunter. That's enough fun.
Okay.
Yeah, you go inside, hit the books with your brother.
Bye.
Thanks, Dad, for watching our 2 little monkeys.
It was their intention to live close to each other.
And with Brian's dad to babysit, the fun continues.
It was a lot of going out and having a good time, cocktails, dancing. They like to have fun.
When they were in the room, they controlled the room. They just were the magnet. Everybody was drawn to them.
Going out is not the only thing they enjoy together.
You feel like Clint Eastwood when you shoot that thing?
And my daddy was my Clint Eastwood. I always wanted to be like him. This is his.
Brian liked weapons, he liked shooting, he liked hunting. So did Trishelle. His favorite weapon was a .45 caliber handgun that had been his father's service weapon.
Can I try? Come on. Promise I'll be careful with your daddy's pistol.
All right.
They had plenty of areas to shoot out there, so they loved living in Bertram.
A natural.
Must be the gun.
Okay. Hey, come on. Come on now. All right. I go.
The fun continues for months.
They always wanted to be at the club. They wanted to be at the bar. They wanted to be at the restaurant.
How about I get the next round, huh?
Yeah.
Until jealousy creeps in.
Their romance between Brian and Trishelle was sometimes rough.
2 whiskey neats, if you please.
Well, I'd like to get to know you.
Make it 3 whiskey neats.
I like your hat. I hope you're a whiskey man. I like my men smoky. You're crazy. Woo!
Trishelle resented anybody that took time away from her and Brian, or at least Brian's attention.
That cut in?
Come on, Trishelle. We were just dancing. Besides, I saw you chatting with that guy at the bar.
Brian wasn't insulted by people admiring his woman. But it was, keep your hands off of her, too.
I was chatting up. You were feeling out.
Oh, you're overreacting.
Enjoy your drink, Brian.
Wow. Tastes even better without the glass.
Burn in hell, Brian.
She would be upset that he would try to make light of the situation.
Oh, come on.
They could laugh and joke and be so la in love, and then the next moment, to hell with you, and, they could go from one extreme to another.
I want to know her name. Or is there more than one?
Dozens. You're tripping, Trishelle. There ain't no one to name.
Don't lie to me, Brian.
Whoa! Get out! Just get... Trishelle, get out of the car right now! No!
The passerby saw Brian pulling Trishelle out of the truck, physically pulling her out of the truck and pushing her to the ground. He stopped and called law enforcement officers.
Get out! Listen!
Brian is arrested and charged with assault.
We were arguing in the truck, and then Brian got rough with me.
That's not true! You tell him the truth, Trishelle!
He went to jail over it and pled guilty.
It's the end of their relationship.
When they did break up, Brian started dating a young lady outside of Austin. Coincidentally, Trishelle was also dating a man that lived in the same apartment complex as Brian's girlfriend.
As luck would have it, Brian and Trishelle are there on the same day.
She had kept a set of keys to that truck.
Brian, come here. There's someone in your car.
What? Are you stalking me?
No! Are you stalking me? What, are you trying to ruin my life?
You're being ridiculous. Now give me that key.
No.
Give me the key. Forget it.
Hey! 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 I know you're in there, Brian. Open up! Brian!
I can't believe you went out with this crazy woman.
Now, Brian's girlfriend, she's afraid at the time because has this woman screaming at the front door and banging on it.
Brian!
The police are called very early on by the girlfriend.
What? Hey, no, guys, there's no problem here. I'll take care of this.
You pay for this.
Well, I didn't do nothing.
Brian had not wanted her arrested at the time. He urged the law enforcement officers that made the scene not to arrest her. She was charged with a misdemeanor assault.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell see passion that's so hot, it burns.
Trishelle throws this intense scene outside of the apartment building as if she is still in a relationship with Brian. And it is almost as if she views him as a possession of hers. Like, this is my person. What are you doing with him? When I think about Trishelle's jealousy, I view it as coming from insecurity. And when people feel insecure, they try to gain control. And I think that Trishelle is trying to control Brian.
Obviously, she didn't think this through too far because this is very unlikely to precipitate Brian coming out going, oh my God, I love you too, let's get back together. But the fact that she feels like she wants to disrupt what he's doing with his new person indicates to me that at least her jealousy is still there, which means feelings are still there for her.
But will those feelings fade away?
He's gonna be okay. The breakups never lasted long, and they, quickly were right back to one another.
Or will they come back with a vengeance?
Alcohol was a big part of the culture of the house. It really was.
After 3 years in an explosive relationship, Brian Allen and Trishelle Green have called it quits. But they can't avoid each other completely.
How they ended up together in a vehicle. I don't recall the actual circumstances, but there was some event that they were both going to be at, and they ended up riding together.
Can I go with them, Mom? Please? Just be careful. Yes, thanks. Watch out!
They went to pass them, and as they did, another car was coming.
He overcorrects and hits the rock wall, the giant rock wall that they blasted out with dynamite to make the road. And Hunter went out the windshield, launched him 50 feet after that.
His neck was cut pretty much from ear to ear. He had a huge gash across his forehead. His eyelid was slit here. It was horrendous. It was horrendous. They spent every day there with him, and he was there for over a week. I know he was. In ICU at that. I'm sure it made them both realize, I do believe they loved each other.
He's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this.
Hunter's accident brought them back together.
I mean, when something like that happens, it really changes everything because of that bonding experience that they thought they were going to lose their son.
The couple decides it's time to turn their lives around.
Both of them had partied quite a bit, and when I say partied, I mean quite a bit of drinking, but they toned that down and tried to set examples for the children.
And Brian starts his own specialized construction company.
Brian built metal buildings, metal structures, and I guess he did something right with it because his business exploded from the very beginning.
The pastor's gonna love this. Ain't that right, boss?
That's right, and don't you forget it. Wait, what are we talking about?
Come here.
His shop was up there next to his dad's, and their trailer used to sit in between the two. He had his work yard right there at home.
And he makes Trishelle 51% owner and majority stockholder.
He had put the business in Trishelle's name because it allowed them to get bids and grants because she was a minority, being a woman.
You may kiss the bride.
These are the golden years for the couple.
They got married on the property at the house, and they changed the boy's last name to be the same as Brian's. He didn't adopt them because changing their name was cheaper. And also he knew that they were his regardless.
Brian, you could tell Brian really loved those boys. They wasn't stepchildren, they was his sons.
Brian and Trishelle really seem to have improved their relationship. Sometimes when there has been a tragedy like what happened to Hunter, it really makes people reassess their values and reconnect and want to be different people. And so I think that that's completely possible at this moment.
At the beginning of Brian and Trishell's relationship, we saw impulsivity, substance abuse, jealousy, and we're not seeing those kinds of things now, and that's great. But you never know when those ingredients might come back out again. They don't tend to disappear.
In just a few short years, the Allens amassed considerable wealth.
He was probably one of the more wealthier people in Bertram. He was doing very well for himself.
It's time to trade up the trailer for something more suitable to their new elite status.
Trishell called it her dream house. She had had it planned, and Brian built that house for her.
To our first week in the house together, baby.
The dream house is completed in 2009, 2 years after they get married.
They moved directly from the trailer into the mansion. Big step up.
Their lifestyle changed significantly.
The Allens' home is a hub for friends, family, and colleagues alike.
It was a beautiful custom-built home with a beautiful pool.
It was a huge palatial home that she basically drew on a napkin.
The house was awesome. It got finished right before our freshman year, I believe, and that whole summer, we were just out there in that awesome pool every single day. It was great.
Hey, boys, good to see you. Come on in.
Brian had a plan to make this giant fortress just to have all of his friends want to come congregate with him.
Off the cuff. Nice. Just in time. I need a refill.
I aim to please, my lady.
And you always do.
And whenever he wanted to have people over, there would be flocks.
Brian's house was very much the compound, the meeting place.
Oh, give me some of that.
But now the party lifestyle they'd avoided comes back, hard.
Brian was trying to slow down on the drinking, but I mean, alcohol was a big part of the culture of the house. It really was.
And that means trouble.
By the time the sun goes down, she was usually pretty lit. He would have had enough. He would only take so much.
After 9 years as a couple, Brian Allen builds his wife Trishell her dream home. It soon becomes party central, except Trishell doesn't just dip in the pool. She dives off the deep end.
Brian really started to clean up and cutting it back and his partying, and he was done. And she was not.
She could be charming. She could be a wonderful friend. She could be a very pleasant wife to Brian until she started drinking. And it was like a switch would flip.
Trishell ramps it up with all of their friends.
Gerald worked for Brian. They were close friends at one point in time.
You really are too cute for your own good, Gerald.
I'm glad you noticed.
When Trishell drank, she would be very flirtatious with the people around and stuff, and she would make it obvious. She didn't try to hide it.
Oh, yeah.
I'd seen her kiss Gerald on the mouth, and they thought it was funny, just to poke fun, I guess, at Brian. I don't know. I didn't think it was funny at all, and I'm surprised Brian didn't smash his face in.
That's not cool, son. Not cool.
The rumors persisted about Gerald and Trishell, and I think Brian believed it. I think Brian knew that there was something more than meets the eye.
But Brian has other concerns about his wife.
Give me some of that.
He's worried that Trishell's drinking is rubbing off on their youngest son, Hunter.
Whoa, what the hell, Hunter?
Mom said we could.
She said, give me that!
Hunter said, "Hey, Mom, can we have some of that whiskey up on top of the fridge?" And she was like, "I'm not saying you can have it, but I don't know how much is in it. Good night."
She didn't really discipline, as far as I could see. I mean, she just pretty much let them do what they wanted to do, whereas Brian was the one that would try to keep them maintained.
The discipline doesn't just stop at home.
He said, "You're joining the Navy. We're going to the recruiting office right now." And we did.
Except with the children away, things deteriorate.
Looking back, she was probably resenting Brian a little bit for pushing the babies out of the nest a little bit, so to speak.
You need to feel free to open up, to tell each other how you feel.
I mean, it's never enough for her.
They were going through couples counseling, through the church to improve their relationship. Brian wanted to make it work. They had come so far. I mean, from having nothing, literally, living in a trailer on his dad's property, to this thriving company that he now owned and operated and was very successful in. They had this beautiful home, huge home. And the boys, too. I mean, they were his boys.
If it weren't for the boys...
If it weren't for the boys, what exactly?
You don't work. You just shop all the time. You sit by the pool and get drunk. I mean, where's the line?
The line is exactly where I say it is.
It just bothered him that she would seem to be depressed and stay around the house and just drink and do things like that rather than doing something productive.
I'm not really sure why they stopped going to counseling. Other things took over.
At this point, it's looking like Trishelle is going back to her dysfunctional behaviors, and Brian has sort of maintained the course, whereas Trishelle, on the other hand, seems to have actually become more self-centered. It's almost like she's disconnected from worrying about other people and caring about other people, and instead she's just sort of doing whatever it is that she feels like.
The absence of her kids now, the fact that she doesn't have to be mothering on a day-to-day basis, probably opens up more of a space in her life than the kids leaving did for him. And anytime somebody who has had a dysfunctional past, somebody who, for example, has engaged in substance abuse in the past, has an opening like that in their life, some of those dysfunctional behavior patterns might come back in to fill that void.
6 years after tying the knot, Brian has had enough.
He would only take so much.
I think he was just tired of her antics.
Brian was getting ready to make a change. Financially, he had a very successful business that had built up, and he was going to lose half of that, but he was going to leave Trishelle.
He was like, I just want her to leave. I'll let her have all this stuff. He said, I'm done.
What are you doing with the gun?
But the price of splitting up will be very, very high.
It was all downhill from there.
Brian Allen is thinking of leaving his wife, even if it means losing half of his fortune. But before he can do anything about it, Trishelle springs a surprise trip on him.
Trishelle had booked a weekend in San Antonio for Brian's birthday.
We needed this. 12 years and we've been mostly great, right?
What are you doing?
He wasn't favorably impressed with that surprise, but he went anyway. From there, things started going downhill.
Let's get wasted like we used to. Remember?
You know, it's not even noon. I thought we talked about not overdoing it.
Relax. Remember fun?
Hey, you can't smoke that in here.
You're being such a smug prick, Brian. As if you never smoked a joint before.
I don't know why you're being such a bitch on my birthday.
Well, I'm sorry, but I thought this was supposed to be a getaway. Us reconnecting.
How in the hell are we supposed to reconnect if you're getting smashed all the time? Damn, this is exactly why we don't talk anymore.
Spare me the lecture, Brian.
Trishelle!
They were fighting in the hotel room, and the noise brought security to their room.
Trishelle, you got company.
Trishelle comes out of the bathroom and says, yes, it's my marijuana. Both of them get kicked out of the hotel.
She went to jail. He sat outside jail all night long in his truck.
Things are pretty much falling apart with Brian and Trishelle, and yet he agrees to go out of town with her. My thinking is a couple of possibilities. First of all, the most likely in my mind is that he's not ready to end the relationship. And so he's trying to sort of play along until he feels like he has the right moment. But I also think it's possible that he thinks, you know what? She's actually trying to do something with me. We're gonna have some time together. Maybe we'll reconnect. Who knows?
It looks to me like Brian thought or hoped that Trishelle was going to get back on the same page with him, and maybe Trishelle's plan was more, hey, the kids are gone, we don't have to be parents, we can both get dysfunctional again. We can both go back to substance abuse, we can both go back to that lifestyle. That's just not where Brian was at that point in his life. And so it looks to me like this trip probably cemented for Brian that no, we are on totally different pages about what we want our lives to look like between now and Dad, and I'm right, that it's over.
Sunday morning, she's released.
He was mad because she had gotten arrested over the weekend in San Antonio, and yet she's mad at Brian because she went to jail for it.
I don't know why she'd be mad at Brian. It wasn't his fault.
They're both still stewing the next day.
Hey! Hey! Get up already! Make me some damn breakfast!
What? I haven't slept in 2 days.
It's 10 in the damn morning.
Useless piece of shit.
She immediately goes back to sleep and woke up at 1 p.m. And then when she woke up, after being asleep till 1 o'clock, Brian wasn't there. Well, that angered her. Said, well, you didn't even text him?
Trishelle and Brian argue on and off all afternoon.
And it seems like her anger is building. Brian apparently texts her and asks her as it's getting closer to 5 is whether she's drinking or not by the pool.
It's not even 5 o'clock and he thinks I'm drunk.
It angered Trishelle when he asked her that by text.
We were hanging out and doing our own thing, but I did notice that she was spending a lot of time texting that day. And she was mad. She was mad that day.
And he comes in, he's drinking a beer when he comes in the door, and that kind of set her off.
And you have the nerve to ask me if I've been drinking.
Hey, I ain't the one with the drinking problem, Trishelle.
Screw you, Brian.
They started to fight, so I left probably about 5:30 in the afternoon.
So she ended up having an argument with him and going into the bedroom and locking it.
A short while later, a friend of Brian's drops by.
Hey, there he is. Hey, you seen Trishelle?
I was talking to Brian, and that's when Roger was there.
Hey, you want a beer? I'm gonna get you a beer.
He came by that afternoon, sometime around 5 o'clock. I just stopped in. I wasn't invited, but a lot of people did that over at Brian and Trishelle's.
Trishy, darling, there you are.
Hey, Roger. Well, you look like you're in need of some fun. Let me get you a beer.
The first time I ever even seen the guy or heard of him, and Brian was not real happy that the guy was there.
They were drinking beer, one thing led to another. They go back down to the house, have the sexual encounter at the house. They go back out on the property until it's getting dark, which is about 9:30 at night. They were intimate. The fella that came over and Trishelle had sexual relationship in the four-wheeler.
They were out in the back pasture having sex while Brian is 300 yards away.
I think it showed a total disregard, lack of respect, and again, this self-centered nature of hers to have sex with somebody else while Brian may have been on the property.
Honey, what are you doing?
You think you can get away with this?
What are you doing with the gun?
I've had enough of your bull. This ends now.
Put that thing away.
No, get back here. Come back.
Harnett County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
My husband came at me with a gun and I got it out of his hands and I shot him.
I pulled up and all the lights were off. That's the first thing I noticed. It was pitch black. I've been over there 3 times a week for 6 months, 7 months. Not one time in my entire life did I ever see it that dark.
I did it.
What did you do? Trishelle, what did you do?
I see Trishelle and it's dark and I noticed that she had some blood on her. And she said, I did it. I did it. I said, you did what? I said, where's Brian? What did you do? What did you do, Trishelle?
Brian's laying right in the doorway that goes from the bathroom into the bedroom. That sergeant goes inside and finds Brian on the floor.
He's coming at me. He's angry. I was in fear of my life. I shot to the left, I shot to the right. He kept coming at me. I had to shoot him. I had to.
Brian Allen is pronounced dead at the age of 38. Shot to death with his own father's service weapon.
I've speculated about the significance of Brian being shot with his favorite weapon. You know, there are varying conclusions that we come to. One is that, okay, it was convenient. He kept it there by the bed on the nightstand.
The investigation begins immediately, starting with Trishelle's 911 call.
Trishelle Allen, when she called 911, had already said, I had to shoot him.
I had to shoot him.
She said, he came at me and I had to shoot him. He came at me and I had to shoot him. She said she was in fear of her life. The fact that she's 5'5" and 129, and Brian's, again, 6'2", 6'3", and weighs 285, would certainly be a consideration for self-defense.
Lending credence to this theory is Brian's previous conviction for assault.
Brian got rough with me.
That's not true. You tell him the truth, Trishelle.
There were various calls of disturbances during their early years.
Except the evidence doesn't add up.
I always hoped that they'd live happily ever after. Not how it worked out.
Self-defense, I didn't believe that for a minute.
Trishelle Allen claims she shot her husband Brian in self-defense after a day of fighting. Authorities immediately ask for an autopsy.
Brian was shot through the shoulder, and that bullet exited under his armpit and went through his left upper arm. The next shot, the shot that actually took Brian's life, went into his back, just to the left of his spine, through his heart, and didn't exit. So being shot twice in the back doesn't exactly comport with her explanation of self-defense.
Nor can police explain why the house was in total darkness.
The lights are off. There'd be no reason to turn the lights off after the shooting. So they must have been off before the shooting occurred. That would have to result in her going into the house after her companion for the evening had left, the fella that came over to visit that she had sex with, going into the house, turning off the lights, getting the pistol, and laying in wait for Brian to walk in.
Because with the lights off, Brian wouldn't be able to see what's coming.
Depending on where the person would be, you might not see her, and that's what looks like it happened.
Police take another listen to the 911 call recording.
There were actually two 911 calls. The first one, Trishelle apparently is calling and trying to call the 911 operator and doesn't realize that the phone has connected. She thinks that no one has answered the phone, and yet the phone's already recorded. And so you can hear her voice in the background say,
"Just die knowing that, you piece of..."
Barnett County 911, what's the address of your emergency?
My husband came at me with a gun and I got it out of his hands and I shot him.
Okay, is he still alive?
Police request Trishelle's phone records and learn that her texts went beyond mere arguments.
We were there swimming and she was texting all day.
She texted that she wished that she could shoot him. She texted that she wanted him to die and be buried in the backyard under pigs. The text messages that Trishelle sent were certainly incriminating, almost a preview of what's to happen. All of these things led to the conclusion that there was no way this could be self-defense.
Get out! You're ruining the vibe!
Trishelle's rage was simmering all day.
She was already texting friends about being angry at Brian. She was angry over the weekend. She was angry at going to jail.
That night, it all boils over.
By the time she's having sex with the guy that came over to visit, it's pretty clear that by then this has reached a critical point. The fact that the lights are off, I think she made the decision that she was going to kill Brian.
Trishelle, I need to talk to you.
Hey,
What are you doing?
I hate you.
He was running from her. He knew she was shooting at him. He knew that she was trying to kill him. He knew.
And deliberately uses Brian's father's gun.
Part of it's convenience, but part of it is just the hatred that Trishelle was expressing. In using that gun, she resented Brian's father. She resented Brian working so much.
Yeah. Just die knowing that, you piece of...
It's very clear that she had a level of anger, a level of violence building up, that she acted with something that was handy, but yet planned.
My husband came at me with a gun and I got it out of his hands and I shot him.
I wanted them to have the happily ever after. I really did. All of them. It didn't work out that way.
In 2015, Trishelle Cara Allen is sentenced to life in prison for Brian's murder.
The jury went out to deliberate a verdict of guilt. It was about 15 minutes when they determined she was guilty of murder. That's very fast.
I think Trishelle murdered Brian because she wasn't going to be dumped. And she wasn't going to lose her marriage. She wasn't going to lose her lifestyle because of him in her eyes, making a decision finally that she wasn't worth staying with. And I think the way Trishelle did it was sort of characteristic of her. It was impulsive. It wasn't well thought out. So I think it was typical Trishelle, spur of the moment, rage-driven decision.
When I think about how Trishelle went about killing Brian, I don't think she put a lot of thought into it at all. And so I think she just figured she's reasonably smart. They had violence in their past. And so if she killed him, she could use a self-defense explanation and that people would buy it. I think that Trishelle ultimately killed Brian because he looked down on her and she felt rejected.
She took a great man's life that day. Man that didn't deserve to die. He had a lot of life left in him. He had a lot of succeeding to do in the world, and he would have done it.
It was just such a waste of life, and he was such just an awesome man, and he made me want to be a better man. He made me want to be a better father.
She couldn't just walk away with half or the house. She could have had a lot. Now she's got nothing, and we're left without Brian's love. I feel like everyone probably needs a dad. I got a little taste of it from Brian because he was so generous with his love. But yeah, she robbed Hunter, and all of us have. I'm sorry.
The morning of April 17th, 2001 began like any other in the quiet suburb of Santa Clara County, California, where the sun rose gently over rows of pastel houses and trimmed lawns, where neighbors waved across driveways and the sound of sprinklers marked the rhythm of suburban life. But by nightfall, that calm routine would fracture into something darker, something that would echo through police files, newspaper headlines, and whispered conversations for decades. It began with a car parked slightly crooked along the curb outside a modest two-story home on Willow Bend Drive. The driver's door was ajar. The engine was cold. Inside, the keys were still in the ignition, and a purse sat on the passenger seat. For passing neighbors, it looked strange, but not alarming at first. Yet within hours, the scene would ignite what investigators would later call one of the most haunting cold cases in the county's history. The owner of the car was 28-year-old Emily Carter, a local elementary school teacher known for her steady smile and quiet kindness. Students adored her. Parents trusted her. Colleagues described her as calm, thoughtful, and predictable in the best possible way. Emily had a routine that rarely changed. She left school around 4 in the afternoon, drove 10 minutes home, watered the small row of roses along her walkway, and often called her sister before cooking dinner. But on that April evening, Emily never made that call. When her sister dialed repeatedly and got no answer, the unease began to grow. By 9 that night, family members contacted police, reporting a mysterious disappearance that immediately struck investigators as unusual. People like Emily Carter didn't just vanish. Patrol officers arrived at Willow Bend Drive shortly before midnight. The porch light was on. The front door was unlocked. Inside the house, everything appeared undisturbed at first glance. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture. The kitchen sink held a single glass. A half-finished grocery list lay on the counter. Upstairs, Emily's bedroom looked as though she had left moments earlier. Her phone charger was plugged into the wall, but the phone itself was missing. Detectives began to sense the chilling possibility that this wasn't a simple missing person case. Something had happened between the moment Emily parked her car and the moment she should have stepped through her front door. Something swift, silent, and terrifying. News of the disappearance spread quickly through the neighborhood. The following morning, local television stations arrived, broadcasting live reports with urgent headlines. Mysterious disappearance shocks quiet community. Cold case fears begin. Residents gathered in small groups along sidewalks, exchanging fragments of speculation. A woman walking her dog told reporters she had seen a dark pickup truck driving slowly through the street earlier that evening. Another neighbor insisted he heard a sudden shout around dusk, but assumed it came from children playing nearby. The pieces didn't yet form a clear picture, but they added to the unsettling atmosphere building around Willowbend Drive. Within 48 hours, search teams combed nearby parks, drainage canals, and wooded trails stretching along the edges of the suburban district. Volunteers distributed flyers with Emily's photograph, dark hair, warm eyes, a friendly smile frozen in time. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlight beams cutting across the quiet streets after sunset. Police divers examined a nearby reservoir, but day after day passed without a trace. No ransom call, no confirmed sighting, no physical evidence pointing toward a suspect. The investigation was rapidly transforming from an urgent search into something colder and far more frustrating, a mystery without a clear beginning or end. Detectives began reconstructing Emily's final known hours. School staff confirmed she had left campus at 4:12 p.m., waving goodbye to colleagues before driving away in her silver sedan. Surveillance cameras at a nearby gas station captured her vehicle passing through an intersection around 4:23 p.m., heading toward her neighborhood. After that moment, the timeline dissolved into uncertainty. The car discovered outside her home suggested she had arrived, yet investigators could not confirm whether she ever stepped inside the house that evening. The distance between the driver's seat and the front door suddenly became the most haunting stretch of pavement in the entire investigation. As weeks turned into months, detectives explored every possible lead. They interviewed coworkers, former classmates, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances. Emily's personal life revealed nothing dramatic, no known enemies, no secret conflicts, no risky habits. She volunteered at community events, helped organize reading programs at the school library, and spent weekends visiting her parents in a nearby town. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more baffling the case became. Sometimes the absence of chaos is itself suspicious, one detective later remarked. When someone disappears without leaving behind a single obvious reason, it means the truth is hiding somewhere quieter. Rumors began circulating in the community. Some believed Emily had been targeted by a stranger passing through the neighborhood. Others whispered about the possibility of someone she knew, someone who understood her routine well enough to strike at the exact moment she arrived home. Police examined the mysterious dark pickup truck mentioned by the dog-walking neighbor, but the description was vague and impossible to verify. In suburban California, thousands of similar trucks moved through residential streets every day. Without a license plate or clear witness identification, the vehicle faded into the background noise of everyday life. By the end of 2002, the investigation had already generated thousands of pages of reports, yet the central question remained unanswered. Where was Emily Carter? The case entered a painful phase familiar to families of the missing, waiting without closure. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Her bedroom remained untouched, her belongings frozen in place like artifacts from a life paused mid-sentence. Each year, detectives revisited the evidence, hoping a forgotten detail might spark a breakthrough. But nothing changed. Leads dried up. Witness memories faded. The file gradually shifted from the active investigation desk into the chilling category labeled cold case. For the Carter family, the phrase cold case carried a weight heavier than any official report. It meant the searchlights were turned off, the helicopters grounded, the neighborhood returned to ordinary life. Yet the mystery never fully disappeared. Every April, local newspapers published brief anniversary articles recalling the baffling disappearance of the beloved teacher. Community members who had once searched fields and forests for clues still remembered the uneasy feeling that something terrible had occurred right under their noses. The quiet street on Willowbend Drive looked peaceful again, but longtime residents sometimes glanced toward the curb where Emily's car had once sat with its door hanging open, as if waiting for someone who never returned. Years stretched into decades. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited the file. Technology advanced, transforming forensic science in ways unimaginable back in 2001. DNA databases expanded. Digital analysis techniques improved. Evidence, once considered insignificant, suddenly carried new possibilities. In 2018, A young detective assigned to the county's cold case unit reopened the Carter file while reviewing unsolved disappearances from the early 2000s. What he saw immediately struck him as unusual. The original investigation had preserved several pieces of trace evidence from Emily's car, including microscopic fibers and partial DNA samples too degraded for testing at the time. Those fragments, forgotten for nearly 20 years, would quietly reopen one of California's most haunting mysteries. The detective requested modern forensic reanalysis. Weeks later, laboratory technicians began applying advanced genetic techniques capable of extracting usable profiles from material previously considered useless. The process moved slowly, each stage requiring careful verification. Investigators avoided speculation, but inside the department a cautious sense of anticipation began to grow. Cold cases sometimes remain frozen forever, but occasionally a single technological breakthrough cracks them open like ice breaking on a winter lake. Then, late one evening, the call finally came from the forensic lab. A partial DNA profile had been developed from fibers recovered inside Emily Carter's car door, and it did not belong to her. The moment the forensic report landed on the detective's desk, the quiet office of the Santa Clara County Cold Case Unit seemed to shift. For years, the Carter file had been little more than a thick archive of frustration, a case investigators reviewed out of duty rather than expectation. But now a new piece of evidence sat at the center of the table like a spark in dry grass. The DNA recovered from microscopic fibers inside Emily Carter's car door belonged to an unidentified male. It was faint, partial, incomplete in places, but it was real. For the first time since 2001, the investigation had something tangible pointing toward another human presence in the final moments before Emily vanished. Detectives immediately began the slow process of running the genetic profile through national databases. The system had grown dramatically since the early 2000s. Millions of samples collected from convicted offenders, crime scenes, and unidentified remains filled the digital network. Each comparison was another silent question sent into the system. Have we seen this person before? Days passed with no result. Then weeks. The database returned the same answer every time. No direct match. Whoever the DNA belonged to had never been arrested for a felony that required entry into the system. In many cold cases, that was where the trail ended. But forensic science had evolved beyond simple database comparisons. Investigators turned to a method that had transformed several famous investigations in recent years: investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for exact matches, the technique looked for distant relatives who might have voluntarily submitted DNA to public ancestry databases. Even a third or fourth cousin could provide a crucial link, narrowing the search from millions of strangers to a single family tree. The process required legal authorization, careful privacy protections, and a great deal of patience. But the Carter case had waited nearly 2 decades. Another few months would not change the stakes. The DNA profile was uploaded into a specialized genealogy database approved for law enforcement analysis. Then the waiting began again. Meanwhile, detectives reopened every aspect of the 2001 investigation with fresh eyes. They reread witness statements, re-examined old photographs of the neighborhood, and studied the timeline of Emily's last day as if it were a puzzle that had finally revealed its first corner piece. The mysterious dark pickup truck mentioned by a neighbor resurfaced in discussions. So, did an overlooked detail buried deep within the original report? A witness who believed they saw a man walking along Willowbend Drive shortly before dusk, someone unfamiliar to the neighborhood. Back in 2001, the description had been too vague to pursue. The witness remembered only fragments: a tall man, possibly in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket, walking quickly as if he had somewhere urgent to be. The street had no sidewalks on one side, forcing pedestrians to move close to parked cars. At the time, investigators had assumed the man was simply a passerby. But now the discovery of unknown male DNA inside Emily's vehicle forced detectives to reconsider every small observation from that evening. Then, 3 months after the genealogy search began, a breakthrough arrived quietly in the form of a digital notification from the forensic genealogist assisting the department. The DNA profile had produced several distant matches in the ancestry database. None were close relatives, but the shared genetic markers suggested a connection to an extended family with roots in Northern California stretching back generations. The genealogist began mapping family trees, tracing descendants, marriages, and geographic movements across decades of public records. What began as hundreds of possible individuals slowly narrowed as branches were eliminated based on age, gender, and location in 2001. Investigators watched the process unfold with cautious excitement. Cold cases often crumble under the weight of false hope, but this time the science pointed steadily toward a smaller and smaller pool of potential identities. After weeks of genealogical reconstruction, the list of possibilities dropped to fewer than 10 men who could plausibly match the DNA profile and who had lived within driving distance of Santa Clara County in 2001. One name among them caught the attention of detectives almost immediately: Daniel Mercer. At the time of Emily Carter's disappearance, Mercer had been 34 years old and working intermittently as a private contractor doing small construction and maintenance jobs across several California suburbs. His employment records showed that he occasionally accepted short-term work in residential neighborhoods, repairing fences, installing garage shelving, clearing yard debris. Nothing about his background initially triggered alarm. He had no major criminal convictions, no violent history, no reason his DNA would appear in any law enforcement database. But one detail made investigators pause. In April 2001, Mercer had completed a short landscaping project less than 2 miles from Willowbend Drive. The discovery did not yet prove anything. California suburbs are filled with contractors moving from job to job every week. But the timing felt too close to ignore. Detectives quietly began building a modern profile of Mercer's life. Public records showed he still lived in the region, though he had moved several times over the years, drifting between small towns and rental properties. Former coworkers described him as quiet, sometimes distant, someone who preferred working alone. No one reported obvious violent behavior, yet several people recalled that he occasionally vanished from jobs without explanation, reappearing months later with a new contract somewhere else. Meanwhile, the genealogist continued confirming that Mercer fit the genetic profile emerging from the DNA evidence. Each branch of the family tree aligned with the biological markers recovered from Emily's car. The statistical probability grew stronger with every calculation. Eventually, the conclusion became unavoidable. Daniel Mercer was a likely candidate for the unknown DNA found at the scene of the disappearance. Still, detectives knew better than to rush forward based on probability alone. Cold cases demand absolute certainty before accusations are made. The next step required obtaining Mercer's DNA directly, but without alerting him to the investigation. Surveillance teams were assigned to observe his daily routine. For several days, officers watched from a distance as Mercer moved through his quiet life in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of San Jose. He worked odd repair jobs, visited a small grocery store near his apartment, and spent evenings alone on his back porch smoking cigarettes. One afternoon, investigators finally saw their opportunity. Mercer left a convenience store carrying a cup of coffee and a plastic bag containing a sandwich wrapper. He sat in his pickup truck for several minutes before tossing the empty cup and wrapper into a public trash bin outside the store. Minutes later, after Mercer drove away, detectives approached the container and carefully retrieved the discarded items. The cup lid still held traces of saliva. The evidence was rushed to the forensic laboratory for comparison testing. Inside the department, tension built rapidly. If the DNA matched the profile recovered from Emily Carter's car, the cold case that had haunted Santa Clara County for nearly 2 decades might finally have a suspect. 3 days later, the results arrived. The DNA from Daniel Mercer's discarded coffee cup matched the genetic profile extracted from the fibers inside Emily Carter's vehicle. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. For years, the case had been defined by absence. No body, no suspect, no explanation. Now a name sat at the center of the mystery. But the discovery raised even more questions than it answered. How had Mercer encountered Emily that evening in 2001? Was he passing through the neighborhood for work, or had he been watching her routine? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if Mercer had been involved in the disappearance, What had happened to Emily after the moment her car door was left open under the fading California sunset? Detectives reopened interviews with neighbors who still lived on Willow Bend Drive. Old memories resurfaced slowly. One resident recalled seeing a pickup truck idling near the corner that week, though she had never paid attention to the driver. Another neighbor remembered a man knocking on doors offering landscaping services shortly before Emily disappeared. The description was vague, but unsettlingly similar to Mercer's appearance 20 years earlier. The pieces were beginning to align in ways that investigators could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Inside the cold case unit, a quiet realization settled over the room. The disappearance of Emily Carter might never have been random, and the man who had lived freely for 2 decades might have been hiding in plain sight the entire time. For nearly 20 years, the disappearance of Emily Carter had existed in the shadowy category investigators call a cold case, a mystery suspended in time, too quiet for headlines, yet too disturbing to forget. But now, with the DNA confirmation linking Daniel Mercer to the fibers inside Emily's car door, the investigation had crossed an invisible line. The case was no longer just a haunting story from 2001 whispered in police hallways and community anniversaries. It was a live investigation again, and for the first time detectives believed the person responsible might still be living an ordinary life somewhere under the same California sun that had set on the night Emily vanished. Inside the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, a small group of detectives began rebuilding the timeline from the ground up, this time with Mercer at the center of the map. They studied every available record from April 2001, every invoice from his contracting jobs, every address where he had briefly worked or visited. Slowly a pattern began to emerge. Mercer's landscaping contract 2 miles from Willow Bend Drive had not been a single afternoon task. According to a receipt recovered from an old property file, he had worked at the residence for nearly 4 days, trimming hedges, replacing sections of a wooden fence, hauling debris into the bed of his pickup truck. For days during which he had been moving through a quiet residential area only minutes from Emily Carter's home. Detectives drove through the neighborhood again, this time not as investigators searching for a missing teacher, but as observers trying to see the environment the way Mercer might have seen it in 2001. The houses stood close enough together for a stranger to move along the street without attracting much attention. Contractors came and went frequently. Yard work, deliveries, repairs. None of it unusual. A man with tools and a pickup truck could blend into the background of suburban life almost invisibly. The thought unsettled investigators. If Mercer had been working nearby for several days, he could have easily noticed Emily's routine. A young woman arriving home from school at the same time every afternoon, parking in the same spot along the curb, walking the same path to the front door. In neighborhoods like Willow Bend Drive, routines become predictable landmarks, and predictable landmarks can attract the wrong kind of attention. Detectives interviewed the homeowners who had hired Mercer in 2001. The couple had since moved to another county, but they still remembered him vaguely. He had been quiet, they said, polite but distant. He worked alone most of the time, occasionally disappearing for an hour or 2 during the afternoon before returning to finish the job. At the time they assumed he had gone to buy supplies or grab lunch. But when investigators asked whether Mercer had ever mentioned other houses nearby, the woman hesitated. She remembered him once asking a casual question while loading tools into his truck. "Who lives in that blue house down the street?" The blue house had been Emily Carter's home. The detail landed heavily in the room as detectives recorded the interview. It was a small question, easily forgotten for decades, yet now it echoed with a chilling implication. Mercer had noticed Emily. Perhaps more than once. With the DNA evidence confirmed and the new witness recollections strengthening the connection, investigators began preparing the next stage of the case, confronting Mercer directly. But before making an arrest, they needed something more concrete than genetic evidence and circumstantial timing. They needed Mercer's own words, or a discovery that would explain what had happened after Emily reached the curb outside her house that evening. Surveillance teams resumed monitoring Mercer's daily life. His routine seemed uneventful. He woke early, drove to small repair jobs, stopped at the same gas station most mornings, and returned to his apartment before dusk. Nothing in his behavior suggested he knew the past was closing in on him. But investigators noticed something peculiar when they examined the bed of his aging pickup truck during one surveillance photograph. The truck was the same model Mercer had owned in 2001. Old, repainted twice, but unmistakably the same vehicle according to registration records. Detectives exchanged uneasy looks when they realized what that meant. If Mercer had used that truck during the week Emily disappeared, it might have been the vehicle seen by the neighbor walking her dog that evening, the dark pickup truck slowly moving through Willowbend Drive. The possibility added urgency to the investigation. Forensic teams obtained a search warrant for Mercer's apartment and vehicle, careful to execute it while he was away on a job site. Inside the small apartment, investigators found little of interest at first. Tools, old magazines, stacks of repair receipts, ordinary clutter from a man who lived alone. But when technicians examined the truck more closely, something unexpected emerged from beneath the worn rubber floor mat in the back seat. A small metal hair clip. It looked ordinary, the kind sold in countless grocery stores and pharmacies. But it had been wedged deep into the seam of the seat, hidden beneath years of dust and dirt. Forensic technicians carefully sealed the object into an evidence bag before sending it to the lab. Back at headquarters, detectives compared photographs of the clip with images from Emily Carter's personal belongings collected in 2001. One picture taken during a family holiday showed Emily wearing a nearly identical clip in her dark hair. It wasn't proof yet. Similar clips existed everywhere. But the coincidence tightened the atmosphere inside the investigation. 2 days later, the lab delivered its analysis. A partial DNA profile recovered from the hair clip matched Emily Carter. The discovery struck like a bolt of electricity through the cold case unit. For 20 years, the investigation had lacked a single piece of physical evidence connecting Emily to a suspect. Now her DNA had been found inside Daniel Mercer's truck. The implications were unavoidable. Detectives moved quickly. An arrest warrant was prepared, detailing the DNA match from the car door fibers, the genealogical identification, the recovered hair clip, and the witness statements placing Mercer near the neighborhood at the time of the disappearance. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence late into the night before signing the authorization. Just after dawn the following morning, a small convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled quietly into Mercer Street. Neighbors watched from windows as officers approached the modest apartment building where Mercer had lived for the past 4 years. The man who had once drifted through suburban landscaping jobs now stood on the edge of a storm he likely never imagined would arrive 2 decades later. Detectives knocked on the door. Mercer answered wearing work boots and a faded jacket, clearly preparing to leave for the day. For a brief moment, he looked confused by the group of officers standing in the hallway. Then the lead detective spoke the words that ended nearly 20 years of silence. "Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest in connection with the disappearance of Emily Carter." Witnesses later described the moment as strangely quiet. Mercer did not shout or attempt to run. His expression shifted slowly from confusion to something else, something colder and harder to read. As officers placed him in handcuffs, one neighbor whispered the questions spreading rapidly through the building. Emily Carter had vanished in 2001. How had the man responsible managed to live freely for 20 years? At the sheriff's office, Mercer sat in an interrogation room under bright fluorescent lights while detectives prepared to ask the questions that had haunted an entire community for decades. Outside the building, reporters were already gathering, drawn by rumors spreading through police scanners and social media. Cold case reopened. Unexpected arrest shocks California community. But inside the interrogation room, the real mystery still waited to be answered. Because despite the arrest, one terrible question remained unresolved. No one had ever found Emily Carter. The interrogation room inside the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office was small, windowless, and painfully quiet, a place designed for long conversations that often carried the weight of years. Daniel Mercer sat at the metal table with his hands resting in front of him, the cuffs removed but still lying nearby like a reminder that the ordinary rhythm of his life had ended that morning. Across from him, 2 detectives placed thick folders on the table. The Carter case file had grown over 2 decades into a mountain of reports, photographs, witness statements, and forensic records. For years it had represented frustration and absence. Now it represented something else entirely, the slow closing of a circle. Mercer watched the detectives with a calm expression that unsettled the investigators more than anger might have. People who had lived with secrets for years sometimes learned to hide their reactions well. The lead detective spoke first, explaining that new forensic evidence connected Mercer to Emily Carter's vehicle on the evening she disappeared in April of 2001. Mercer listened without interrupting, his eyes moving slowly from the detective to the file folders and back again. Outside the building, news had already begun spreading through Santa Clara County. Local radio stations interrupted morning programming with urgent updates. Television banners flashed dramatic headlines. California 2001 cold case reopened. Unexpected arrest shocks community. For older residents of Willow Bend Drive, the announcement felt surreal. Many of them had lived with the uneasy memory of that night for nearly 20 years. Now the mystery they once believed might never be solved had suddenly returned to the center of public attention. Back inside the interrogation room, the detectives began laying out the evidence piece by piece. The DNA recovered from microscopic fibers inside Emily Carter's car door. The genealogical investigation that had led to Mercer's name. The surveillance that collected his discarded coffee cup. The laboratory confirmation linking his DNA to the scene of the disappearance. Mercer remained silent as each fact was presented. His posture hardly changed. Only once did he glance away from the table, staring briefly toward the blank wall, as if measuring the distance between past and present. Then the second detective introduced the detail that shifted the atmosphere in the room. The hair clip recovered from Mercer's pickup truck. The detective placed a photograph of the clip on the table and slid it forward. For the first time since the interrogation began, Mercer's composure seemed to flicker. It lasted only a second, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle change in the rhythm of his breathing. But experienced investigators noticed those small fractures in calm behavior. The detective continued speaking, explaining that DNA extracted from the clip matched Emily Carter. The object had been hidden beneath the rear seat floor mat of Mercer's truck, a vehicle he had owned since before 2001. The implication was impossible to ignore. Mercer had been in direct contact with Emily at some point during the hours surrounding her disappearance. The room fell silent again. Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. He said he had never met Emily Carter. The denial was expected. Investigators in cold cases often hear the same response when suspects realize how much time has passed since the crime. Memory becomes an easy shield. But the detectives continued pressing forward, describing Mercer's landscaping job near Willow Bend Drive during the week of the disappearance. They explained how witnesses remembered a man matching his description walking along the street. They mentioned the neighbor, who recalled a dark pickup truck moving slowly through the area that evening. Mercer listened to the growing list of connections, yet his answer remained unchanged. He had never met Emily Carter. Hours passed inside the interrogation room as detectives returned to the same questions from different angles. Where were you on April 17, 2001? Did you ever knock on doors in that neighborhood offering landscaping work? Did you ever speak with the woman who lived in the blue house down the street? Mercer's responses grew shorter as the afternoon faded toward evening. I don't remember. I did a lot of jobs back then. It was a long time ago. While the interrogation continued, another team of investigators began searching locations connected to Mercer's past. Old rental properties, storage units, construction sites where he had once worked. The hope was fragile but persistent. If Mercer had taken Emily Carter somewhere after the encounter outside her home, there might still be traces hidden in places no one had examined during the original investigation. Meanwhile, the Carter family gathered quietly at their home after receiving the news that an arrest had been made. Emily's sister had spent nearly 2 decades repeating the same painful sentence whenever reporters asked about the case. We still don't know what happened. Now that sentence felt as if it might finally be nearing its end, yet another fear lingered behind the relief. What if the truth was worse than they imagined? Back in the interrogation room, detectives eventually changed their strategy. Instead of confronting Mercer with accusations, they spoke about Emily herself. They described the life she had lived before the disappearance, the elementary school classroom filled with drawings from her students, the weekends visiting her parents, the quiet routine that ended so abruptly that April evening. They talked about the search efforts that followed, the volunteers who combed through parks and fields, the neighbors who left porch lights on for weeks hoping she might somehow return. Mercer listened without expression. Then one detective leaned forward and spoke softly.
20 years, he said.
20 years without answers. If something happened that night, this is your chance to explain it. For a long moment, Mercer said nothing. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. Finally, he rubbed his hands together slowly and looked down at the metal table. When he spoke again, the words came carefully, as if each one required calculation. He admitted that he had been on Willow Bend Drive that week. He admitted that he sometimes walked the street after finishing landscaping work nearby. But he insisted that the encounter with Emily had been accidental. According to Mercer, he had approached her car that evening simply to ask whether she needed yard work done. She had just parked outside her house, he said, and he thought she might be another potential customer. Mercer claimed that Emily became frightened when he stepped too close to the vehicle. She tried to close the door. He reached out to steady it. That was how his DNA ended up on the car. That was how the hair clip might have fallen into his truck. The explanation hung in the air like a fragile thread. Detectives exchanged glances. The story might have sounded plausible, if not for one devastating fact. Emily Carter had never been seen again. The lead detective leaned forward once more and spoke the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. If it was only a conversation, he asked quietly, then where did she go? Mercer did not answer. Instead, he stared at the table in silence as the room filled once again with the heavy weight of the unknown. Outside the sheriff's office, the sky over Santa Clara County had turned dark, and television cameras lined the sidewalk waiting for the next development in a story that had slept for 2 decades. The headlines continued to grow more urgent with each passing hour. Cold case breakthrough. New evidence after 20 years. Community demands answers. But inside the interrogation room, the most important answer remained just beyond reach. Because even with an arrest, even with DNA and witnesses, and a suspect sitting only a few feet away, the deepest mystery of all still remained unsolved. No one knew where Emily Carter had gone after the moment her car door opened on that quiet California street. And somewhere beyond the walls of the sheriff's office, the truth of that final night was still waiting to be uncovered. Night settled over Santa Clara County, while the interrogation room lights continued burning with the same harsh brightness that had filled the space since morning. Daniel Mercer remained seated at the metal table, shoulders slightly hunched now, the calm composure he had shown earlier beginning to wear thin under the slow pressure of time and questions. Across from him, the detectives had not raised their voices, had not rushed the process. Cold case interrogations rarely relied on confrontation alone. Instead, they depended on patience, on the quiet realization that the past had finally caught up. Outside the building, the media presence had grown larger, satellite vans crowding the parking lot as reporters repeated the same electrifying phrase again and again. A 20-year cold case reopened, a suspect finally in custody. Yet inside the room, the truth was still tangled somewhere between Mercer's carefully chosen words and the evidence, waiting in thick folders on the table. The detectives returned to the timeline once more, reconstructing the narrow window of time when Emily Carter arrived home that evening in April of 2001. The street had been quiet. Neighbors were inside preparing dinner, children finishing homework, televisions flickering behind drawn curtains. Emily parked along the curb just as she had done hundreds of times before. Her driver's door opened. The purse remained on the passenger seat. The keys stayed in the ignition. Something interrupted the ordinary rhythm of those seconds. Something forced the routine to collapse into chaos so quickly that she never even stepped through her front door. Mercer had admitted being on the street. That admission alone had already shattered the image he had tried to present earlier, the version of events where he was merely an unrelated contractor passing through the neighborhood sometime that week. Now detectives pressed further. If the conversation had truly been harmless, If he had simply approached her car to ask about yard work, why had Emily's DNA ended up hidden inside his truck? Why had the hair clip fallen deep beneath the back seat floor mat? Those were not the details of a brief exchange between strangers standing politely on a sidewalk. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly, staring at the surface of the table as if searching for words there. When he spoke again, his explanation changed slightly. He said Emily had stepped out of the car during the conversation. She had seemed nervous, he claimed, and he tried to reassure her. Perhaps she dropped the clip while brushing hair away from her face. Perhaps it stuck to his jacket and later fell inside the truck. He insisted there had been no struggle. The detectives let the silence stretch after he finished speaking. The story sounded thinner with every repetition. There were too many missing pieces, too many coincidences that only seemed to exist in Mercer's version of the evening. The lead investigator finally leaned forward and slid another photograph across the table. It was an image taken during the original search effort in 2001, showing the open driver's door of Emily Carter's car illuminated by police flashlights. The angle revealed something investigators had documented but never fully understood at the time, a faint scuff mark on the pavement beside the door, as if someone had lost footing during a sudden movement. Mercer looked at the picture for a moment before glancing away. The detective spoke quietly. That mark wasn't noticed by neighbors at the time. But when forensic technicians reviewed the old photographs during the cold case reopening, they realized something important. The scuff suggested sudden force, possibly a struggle beside the car. It matched the theory that Emily never had the chance to step away from the vehicle voluntarily. Again, the room fell silent. Mercer shifted in his chair, the calm mask beginning to crack around the edges. The detectives continued describing the evidence accumulating around him. The genealogy match connecting his family line to the DNA sample. The recovered hair clip linking Emily directly to his truck. The witness recollections placing a pickup vehicle on the street that evening. The timeline showing he had been working only minutes away. Each detail tightened the invisible circle surrounding him. Outside the interrogation room, another development was unfolding. Investigators searching Mercer's past properties had uncovered a small storage unit he rented briefly in late 2001, several months after Emily disappeared. The unit had been cleared long ago, yet the building owner still possessed old rental records and surveillance photographs from that period. One image showed Mercer backing his pickup truck toward the storage door on a warm August afternoon. The photograph itself revealed nothing unusual, but the timing caught detectives' attention. Why would a man working temporary contracting jobs suddenly rent storage space months after the disappearance that had quietly shaken the entire county? The information was brought into the interrogation room late that night. The detective placed the storage facility photograph beside the image of Emily's car. Mercer stared at both pictures without speaking. The investigator explained that search teams would be examining the property surrounding the old storage building at first light. Ground-penetrating radar. Soil analysis. Modern technology that had not been available when the case first went cold. For the first time during the long interrogation, Mercer's breathing changed noticeably. It was subtle, almost invisible, but experienced detectives recognized the signal immediately. Pressure had reached the point where silence became more dangerous than speaking. The lead detective did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the steady tone of someone describing the inevitable. If Emily Carter died that night, he said quietly, we will eventually find out where she went. It may take days, maybe weeks, but the truth always surfaces. The only question left is whether you help explain it now. Mercer's eyes remained fixed on the photograph of the storage facility. Minutes passed without a word. Then he asked a question that sent a ripple of tension through the room. What happens if someone didn't mean for it to go that far? The detectives exchanged a brief glance. It was the first crack in the wall Mercer had built around his story. The lead investigator answered carefully. If something happened by accident, telling the truth matters. Families deserve answers. The courts consider honesty differently than silence. Mercer closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly as if releasing a breath he had been holding for 20 years. When he opened them again, the calm expression was gone. In its place was something heavier, something worn down by the weight of time. He said he had approached Emily's car that evening because he had seen her arriving home alone several times during the week. He had convinced himself it would be an easy conversation, just a chance to ask about landscaping work. But when he stepped too close to the vehicle, she became frightened. She tried to close the door quickly. Mercer reached forward, trying to stop it from hitting his hand. The movement turned into a struggle. Emily pushed past him, attempting to run toward the house. Mercer grabbed her arm. She screamed. The sound panicked him. According to Mercer's account, he tried to pull her back toward the truck to quiet her. In the confusion, she struck her head against the side of the vehicle. The impact stunned her, leaving her disoriented and unable to stand. Mercer claimed he had not intended to hurt her, but the moment had already spiraled beyond control. He looked down at the table as he continued speaking. He said he panicked when he realized someone might have heard the scream. And that was when everything truly began to go wrong. The detectives listened without interrupting as the man sitting across from them finally began unraveling the secret he had carried through 2 decades of ordinary life. Because the story of that quiet suburban street in April of 2001 was no longer just a disappearance. It was the beginning of a truth that had remained buried for 20 years. And now, piece by piece, it was finally coming back into the light. For 20 years, the story of Emily Carter had existed only as a question, a disappearance suspended in uncertainty, a cold case file that seemed destined to remain unfinished. But inside the interrogation room that night, the silence that had surrounded the case for decades was finally beginning to fracture. Daniel Mercer sat motionless beneath the fluorescent lights, his shoulders slightly lowered now. The careful control he had maintained for hours slowly dissolving as the weight of the past pressed down on him. The detectives did not interrupt as he spoke. They understood that once a confession begins to surface after so many years, even the smallest interruption can cause it to collapse back into silence. Mercer stared at the metal table while continuing the story of the moment that had spiraled beyond his control. He said that after Emily struck her head against the side of the truck, she collapsed to the pavement beside the open driver's door. For several seconds, she did not move. Mercer claimed he froze, unable to process what had just happened. The neighborhood remained quiet. No doors opened. No voices called out from nearby houses. Yet in his mind, the entire street had suddenly become a place of danger, every window a possible witness. He knelt beside Emily, he said, shaking her shoulder and whispering for her to wake up. She groaned faintly, disoriented, her breathing uneven. At that moment, Mercer realized something that terrified him more than the struggle itself. Emily had seen his face clearly. If she recovered and called the police, his life would collapse. Panic replaced every other thought. He looked up and down the street, convinced someone would appear at any second. That was when he made the decision that would define the next 20 years of his life. Mercer said he lifted Emily into the passenger side of his pickup truck. Her purse remained inside her own car, the keys still in the ignition, the driver's door hanging open exactly the way neighbors would later describe it when police arrived. Mercer drove away quickly, turning the corner at the end of Willowbend Drive before anyone could notice the sudden movement. He told detectives that Emily regained partial consciousness during the drive. She tried to sit up, confused and frightened, asking where he was taking her. Mercer claimed he attempted to calm her, telling her he would drop her somewhere safe, that everything had been a misunderstanding. But the situation continued to unravel. According to Mercer, Emily began screaming again when she realized she was being taken away from her home. The noise sent another surge of panic through him. He pulled the truck onto a narrow service road near an undeveloped stretch of land on the outskirts of a county. The area had once been farmland but had since fallen into neglect, patches of dirt and overgrown brush scattered between abandoned irrigation ditches. Mercer said he stopped the truck there, hoping to quiet her before anyone driving nearby might hear. The detectives listened carefully as he described what happened next. He claimed he tried to hold Emily down while telling her to stop shouting. In the struggle, she struck the inside of the truck door again, this time harder. Her movements slowed. Her breathing became shallow. Mercer said he realized something was terribly wrong. He shook her repeatedly, calling out to her, but she did not respond. For a long time, he simply sat there in the darkness of the truck cab, trying to convince himself she would wake up. She never did. The confession hung heavily in the interrogation room. For years, investigators had imagined countless scenarios to explain Emily Carter's disappearance. Now the truth was finally emerging from the only person who had witnessed those final moments. Mercer's voice remained low as he described the fear that followed the realization that Emily was no longer breathing. Instead of calling for help, instead of admitting what had happened, he allowed the panic to guide his next decision. He drove deeper into the rural outskirts of the county until he found a narrow dirt road leading toward an isolated field bordered by thick brush. It was a place he remembered from previous contracting jobs, an empty stretch of land where construction debris was sometimes dumped illegally. Mercer said he carried Emily's body away from the truck and into the darkness, placing her near a cluster of low trees before covering the area with loose soil and scattered branches. The burial was shallow, rushed, and imperfect, yet he believed it would remain hidden. Afterward, he returned to the truck and drove back toward the city, convincing himself the nightmare might somehow fade if he simply resumed his ordinary routine. The detectives asked him why he had kept the truck for so many years after the crime. Mercer said he never thought about it in those terms at first. It was simply the vehicle he owned, the one he used for work. Over time, the memory of that night became something he forced into the farthest corner of his mind. The truck remained, accumulating scratches and repairs and layers of dust until it became just another aging vehicle on California roads. But the hair clip had remained beneath the back seat, a tiny piece of evidence waiting patiently through 2 decades. Outside the interrogation room, the news of Mercer's confession had not yet been released, but investigators were already preparing the next phase of the case. Teams were organizing a search of the rural property Mercer had described. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was being loaded into trucks. Forensic specialists reviewed satellite images of the area from 2001 and compared them with modern maps. If Mercer's account was accurate, the remains of Emily Carter might finally be recovered after 20 years of uncertainty. Inside the room, the detectives asked Mercer one final question. "Why did you never come forward?" Mercer's answer came slowly. He said that after the burial, he told himself it had been an accident, a moment of panic that spiraled too far. But every day that passed made it harder to admit the truth. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The disappearance faded from national headlines, though it never vanished from the local memory of Santa Clara County. Mercer watched news reports about the search efforts and the growing frustration of investigators. Each time he considered speaking, fear stopped him. Eventually, silence became his normal life. Until the day the detectives knocked on his door. The interrogation ended just before dawn. Mercer was escorted from the room and formally booked on charges connected to the abduction and death of Emily Carter. Outside the sheriff's office, reporters were still waiting under the pale glow of parking lot lights, unaware that inside the building one of the county's most haunting cold cases had finally reached its turning point. Yet the story was not finished. Because somewhere beyond the quiet suburbs, beyond the neighborhoods where Emily had once walked home from work, there was still a patch of forgotten land where Mercer claimed he had buried the truth. And after 20 years, investigators were about to begin digging. The morning after Daniel Mercer's confession arrived with a strange mixture of urgency and quiet determination inside the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. For 2 decades, the disappearance of Emily Carter had existed as an unanswered question, a mystery frozen in the pages of an ever-growing case file. Now the investigation had finally reached the place detectives once feared they might never see, a confession and a location. But even a confession after 20 years could not be taken at face value. Memories distort, suspects lie, and landscapes change. The truth still had to be proven beneath the soil. Before sunrise, a convoy of county vehicles rolled north along a narrow highway that cut through the outer edge of the valley. Inside the trucks were forensic specialists, search technicians, and equipment that investigators in 2001 could only have imagined using. Ground-penetrating radar systems capable of mapping disturbances beneath the earth. Precision GPS markers. Evidence recovery kits prepared for the possibility of human remains. The destination Mercer had described during his confession lay in an undeveloped area beyond the suburban grid, a place that once held scattered farmland but had gradually faded into an overgrown patch of neglected land caught between expanding towns. The sky was still pale when the first vehicles turned off the highway and onto the dirt access road Mercer had mentioned. The road itself looked almost forgotten, cracked and partially swallowed by weeds. Investigators stepped out into the cool morning air and surveyed the landscape. Low brush stretched across the field in tangled clusters, interrupted occasionally by the skeletal remains of old irrigation posts. In the distance, a line of trees formed a natural barrier along the edge of the property. It was quiet enough that the faint hum of equipment could be heard long before technicians began setting up their gear. Detectives studied the printed transcript of Mercer's confession again while standing near the vehicles. According to his statement, he had carried Emily Carter's body roughly 50 yards from where he parked the truck before choosing a spot near a cluster of trees. 20 years had passed since that night. Wind, rain, and seasonal growth had transformed the terrain countless times. What Mercer remembered as a small clearing might now be hidden beneath layers of vegetation. Search teams began working methodically, dividing the field into carefully measured grids. Technicians moved the ground-penetrating radar slowly across the soil, watching the digital monitor for any sign of unnatural disturbances beneath the surface. Each subtle irregularity triggered another marker placed in the dirt, another point that might represent buried debris, old construction waste, or something far more significant. While the search progressed, news of Mercer's confession began leaking to reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office. Within hours, the story spread across California media outlets. A cold case that had once seemed permanently frozen had erupted back into public attention with shocking clarity. Headlines appeared online and across television screens. Confession in 2001 disappearance. Suspect reveals burial site after 20 years. Community awaits answers. In Santa Clara County, the news hit especially hard along Willowbend Drive, the quiet street where Emily Carter's car had been discovered that April evening 2 decades earlier. Some of the same residents who had once joined volunteer search teams stood together again in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about the sudden turn in the investigation. Many of them had carried the uneasy memory of that night for years, wondering how something so terrible could have happened in the middle of their peaceful neighborhood. Back at the search site, the radar equipment began detecting its first significant anomaly shortly before noon. The technician studying the screen noticed a subtle disruption in the soil layers approximately 3 feet beneath the surface. It was not large, but the shape was irregular in a way that suggested the ground had been disturbed at some point in the past. Investigators placed a bright marker beside the location and carefully expanded the search grid around it. Another anomaly appeared only a few yards away. Then another. The pattern suggested that the soil in that section of the field had been altered long ago, perhaps during the same brief period Mercer described in his confession. The team prepared excavation tools while forensic specialists photographed every inch of the area before the first shovel touched the ground. In cold cases like this, even the smallest mistake could destroy evidence that had survived for decades. The excavation began slowly. Layer by layer, the soil was removed, each scoop placed carefully onto evidence tarps where technicians examined it for fragments of bone, fabric, or personal belongings. Hours passed beneath the growing heat of the afternoon sun. The field remained silent except for the careful rhythm of shovels cutting into dirt and the quiet instructions of forensic investigators guiding the process. Then, late in the afternoon, one of the technicians stopped digging abruptly. Something pale had appeared within the dark soil. At first, it was only a small curve barely visible beneath the surrounding earth, but as the technician brushed away loose dirt with a gloved hand, the shape became unmistakable. The smooth surface of human bone. A hush spread across the excavation site. Investigators immediately halted all digging in the surrounding area, while forensic anthropologists moved closer to examine the discovery. Slowly, they exposed more of the buried remains, revealing the fragile structure of what appeared to be a human forearm partially preserved beneath layers of soil and roots. The position matched the approximate depth Mercer had described. For the detectives standing nearby, the moment carried a heavy mixture of relief and sorrow. After 20 years, the search for Emily Carter had finally reached the place where the mystery ended. But the excavation continued carefully for several more hours, revealing additional remains that confirmed the grim truth of Mercer's confession. Fragmented bones, pieces of clothing, and personal items gradually emerged from the ground, each one documented and sealed as evidence. Among the recovered objects was a small ring that matched photographs of jewelry Emily had worn regularly before she disappeared. As the sun began setting behind the distant hills, investigators stood quietly around the excavation site. The remains would be transported to the county medical examiner's office for formal identification and forensic analysis, but there was little doubt about what had been found. Emily Carter had been lying beneath that forgotten field for 20 years. The discovery would soon be announced publicly, bringing a wave of emotion across the community that had once searched so desperately for answers. Families who had followed the case since 2001 would finally know the truth. The Carter family, who had endured 2 decades of uncertainty, would at last be able to bring their daughter home. Yet, even as investigators prepared the evidence for transport, another realization settled over the search team. Cold cases rarely end the moment a suspect confesses. Because now that Emily Carter had been found, the full story of that April night in 2001 would move from the interrogation room to the courtroom, where every detail would be examined under the harsh light of justice. And after 20 years of silence, the community that had once been shocked by her disappearance was about to hear the entire truth. The discovery in the overgrown field spread through Santa Clara County with a speed that felt almost unreal. By the time the sun set that evening, reporters were already standing at the edge of the dirt road leading toward the excavation site, broadcasting live updates while police tape fluttered quietly in the warm California wind. The words many people had waited nearly 2 decades to hear were finally spoken by the sheriff during a brief press conference outside the county building. Human remains had been recovered from the location identified by Daniel Mercer. The remains were believed to be those of Emily Carter, the elementary school teacher whose mysterious disappearance in April of 2001 had haunted the community for 20 years. For the Carter family, the announcement arrived with a mixture of grief and a strange, fragile sense of closure. Emily's parents had grown older during the long years of uncertainty, their lives shaped by a question that never stopped echoing through holidays, birthdays, and quiet evenings at home. Her sister, who had been the one to report her missing that first night, sat silently beside them as the news played across television screens. For so long they had imagined countless possibilities, hopeful ones, terrifying ones, and the empty possibility that the truth might never be known. Now the truth had been pulled from the ground beneath an abandoned field. At the county medical examiner's office, forensic specialists began the careful process of confirming the identity of the remains. Although Mercer's confession had pointed investigators to the burial site, scientific verification was still required before authorities could officially declare the case solved. The bones recovered from the field were fragile after so many years underground, but enough evidence remained to conduct DNA comparison testing against samples provided by Emily's surviving relatives. The results came back within days. The remains belonged to Emily Carter. The confirmation ended one chapter of the story, but it also opened another far more public phase of the case. Daniel Mercer, the man who had lived quietly across California for 2 decades while the mystery of Willow Bend Drive lingered unresolved, was now facing formal charges in court. Prosecutors announced that Mercer would be tried for kidnapping and murder, supported by the evidence uncovered through the cold case investigation. The DNA found inside Emily's car door, the hair clip recovered from his truck, the confession he had given during interrogation, and the discovery of Emily's remains exactly where he had described burying them. The courtroom proceedings began several months later inside a packed county courthouse. The trial immediately drew intense attention from media outlets across the state. For many observers, the case represented something larger than one crime. It was a demonstration of how modern forensic science could resurrect investigations long believed to be lost to time. Detectives who had worked the case in 2001 sat quietly among the spectators, watching as the evidence they once struggled to interpret finally formed a complete picture. Prosecutors opened the trial by reconstructing the final hours of Emily Carter's life. They described the routine she followed every weekday afternoon, the predictable drive home from the elementary school where she taught third grade, the moment she parked her car along the curb of Willowbend Drive. They showed jurors photographs taken that night when officers first arrived, images of the driver's door hanging open beneath the glow of police flashlights. They explained how investigators initially believed the case might involve a random abduction, how countless leads were chased across the state before eventually fading into silence. Then the prosecutors shifted the focus to the breakthrough that had reopened the investigation nearly 20 years later. They described the microscopic fibers preserved inside the door frame of Emily's car and how advances in DNA analysis allowed technicians to extract a usable profile from evidence that had once been considered useless. Jurors listened closely as forensic experts explained the process of investigative genetic genealogy, mapping distant relatives through public databases until one name emerged among the possible family connections: Daniel Mercer. The courtroom remained silent as the experts detailed the moment investigators confirmed the match using Mercer's discarded coffee cup. They explained how the hair clip found hidden inside his pickup truck contained Emily's DNA, linking the suspect directly to the victim for the first time. Each piece of evidence built on the last, forming a chain that led inevitably toward the confession Mercer had given during interrogation. The defense attorneys attempted to challenge the reliability of Mercer's statements, suggesting that the pressure of questioning might have influenced his recollection of events. They argued that Mercer had described the encounter with Emily as a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act of violence. According to their argument, the struggle beside the car had been brief and chaotic, escalating beyond his control. But prosecutors responded by pointing to the most devastating detail of all: Mercer had chosen to conceal the crime instead of seeking help. He had transported Emily away from her home, buried her body in an isolated field, and lived freely for 2 decades while her family searched for answers. Witness after witness testified about the impact of Emily Carter's disappearance on the community. Former students described the teacher who had encouraged them to read, who stayed late after school to help struggling children with homework. Neighbors from Willowbend Drive recalled the moment police cars filled the quiet street that night in 2001, the uneasy feeling that something terrible had happened close to home. Even investigators who had long since retired from the sheriff's office returned to explain the original search efforts, the endless interviews, and the frustration of watching the case slowly fade into the cold case archive. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Emily's sister took the stand. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the final phone call she had expected that evening, the routine conversation that never happened. She spoke about the years that followed, the birthdays that passed without celebration, the empty chair at family gatherings where Emily should have been sitting. The courtroom listened in complete silence as she explained what it meant to live with unanswered questions for 20 years. When the testimony ended, the jury needed only a short time to reach its decision. Daniel Mercer was found guilty. The verdict brought a quiet wave of relief through the courtroom. For the Carter family, it meant the long search for truth had finally reached its end. For the investigators who had reopened the case after nearly 2 decades, it proved that even the coldest mysteries can still be solved when persistence and science meet at the right moment. Outside the courthouse, reporters repeated the same phrase that had appeared in headlines across the state: California 2001 cold case reopened. New evidence leads to unexpected arrest. Yet beyond the legal victory, the story carried a deeper reminder that echoed through the community. For 20 years, the disappearance of Emily Carter had been a haunting mystery, a question whispered whenever neighbors remembered the strange sight of a car door left open on a quiet suburban street. Now the truth had finally surfaced. But the memory of that night in April 2001 would never completely fade. Because some stories do not end when the case is closed. They remain in the quiet streets where everything once seemed ordinary, reminding a community that even the calmest places can hold secrets waiting decades to be uncovered. Long after the verdict was announced and the courtroom emptied, the story of Emily Carter continued to echo through Santa Clara County like a quiet aftershock. The legal process had reached its conclusion. Daniel Mercer had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, the judge describing the crime as a devastating act of violence followed by 2 decades of silence that prolonged the suffering of an entire family. Yet for the community that had carried the mystery for so long, the end of the trial did not feel like the end of the story. Instead, it felt like the slow closing of a chapter that had been left unfinished for 20 years. In the weeks following the sentencing, investigators returned once more to Willow Bend Drive. The quiet suburban street looked almost identical to the way it had appeared on the evening Emily disappeared. The same neat rows of houses stood beneath tall trees. The same driveways stretched toward garages where bicycles leaned against walls and children's toys lay scattered across lawns. For newcomers to the neighborhood, the street appeared peaceful and ordinary. But longtime residents still remembered the moment when police lights first washed across the pavement in April of 2001. One of the detectives who had worked the reopened case stood at the curb where Emily's car had once been found. The memory described in old reports now felt vivid and real. The driver's door hanging open, the purse resting untouched on the passenger seat. The unsettling realization that someone had vanished in a narrow space between stepping out of a vehicle and reaching the front door of a home. Crimes often leave behind chaos, broken glass, overturned furniture, visible violence. But the Carter case had always been defined by its eerie simplicity. A quiet street, an open door, a life that simply stopped. Across the county, the school where Emily had once taught third grade held a small memorial gathering in her honor. Many of her former students were now adults with families of their own, yet they still remembered the teacher who had filled her classroom with reading charts and handwritten notes of encouragement. Some brought photographs they had saved for years, pictures from school events where Emily stood smiling among groups of children. Others spoke softly about the day the principal had gathered students in the gymnasium to explain that their teacher would not be returning. For them, the case had always existed somewhere between childhood memory and unresolved tragedy. Now, with the truth finally known, those memories carried a different weight. Emily's family attended the gathering quietly, surrounded by people who had followed the story for decades. Her parents, older now than they had ever imagined being without their daughter, listened as speakers described the kindness she had shown to students who struggled with reading and writing. One former student told the audience that Emily had once stayed after school for an hour just to help him finish a book he believed he would never understand. That simple act of patience had changed the direction of his life. Moments like that reminded everyone present that Emily Carter was not only the victim of a crime that shocked California headlines. She had been a person whose influence continued long after her voice disappeared from the classroom. Meanwhile, the investigation itself began to settle into the quiet phase that follows every solved case. Evidence collected during the search of the burial site was cataloged and archived. The trucks and radar equipment returned to storage. Detectives who had spent months reopening the old file gradually shifted their attention to other unsolved mysteries waiting inside the cold case unit. But the Carter investigation left behind something important for the department. It proved that time does not erase every crime. The DNA sample that led to Daniel Mercer's arrest had been hidden inside Emily's car for 20 years, preserved by chance and careful evidence storage. In 2001, the technology to interpret it did not exist. Investigators had looked at the microscopic fibers and realized they might contain something valuable, yet they lacked the tools to unlock the information trapped inside them. Only decades later, when science advanced far enough to extract a usable genetic profile, did the evidence reveal its secret. The breakthrough reminded detectives across the state that countless cold cases might still contain similar clues waiting for the right technology to arrive. News outlets covering the Carter case emphasized that point repeatedly. The phrase cold case breakthrough appeared in headlines across the country. Experts explained how investigative genetic genealogy had already helped solve other long-dormant crimes, connecting suspects to evidence through distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted DNA to ancestry databases. The method was controversial in some circles, raising questions about privacy and the expanding reach of forensic science. Yet for families like the Carters, the technique represented something powerful, the possibility that time alone could no longer guarantee that a crime would remain hidden forever. Back in Santa Clara County, the field where Emily's remains had been discovered slowly returned to its quiet state. After the forensic work was completed, the disturbed soil was carefully restored, leaving only a faint difference in the landscape visible to those who knew exactly where to look. A small wooden cross was placed near the edge of the tree line by someone who had followed the case closely. No one ever admitted to placing it there, yet flowers occasionally appeared beside it during the weeks after the trial ended. For many people, the cross became a quiet symbol of the moment when the mystery finally came to light. Daniel Mercer, now living behind prison walls, would likely spend the rest of his life reflecting on the decisions that began on that quiet street 2 decades earlier. Investigators later noted that the case illustrated a chilling truth about violent crimes committed in moments of panic. Many offenders believe that if they hide their actions long enough, the world will eventually forget. They convince themselves that the past can be buried the same way Mercer buried Emily Carter in that forgotten field. But the Carter case proved something different. Even the smallest fragment of evidence can survive. Even a hair clip lost beneath the seat of an old truck can wait patiently for 20 years before revealing what happened. And even a community that once believed the truth might never surface can one day hear the final answer to a question that has haunted it for decades. As time passed, the story of the California 2001 cold case gradually shifted from breaking news to a lasting reminder. Detectives who studied the investigation later described it as a perfect example of persistence meeting opportunity. The original investigators who preserved the evidence could not have known that technology would someday unlock its secrets. Yet their careful work ensured that when the right tools finally existed, the truth would still be waiting. And somewhere in the quiet neighborhoods of Santa Clara County, people who remembered the strange sight of an open car door on Willow Bend Drive still carry that image in their minds. Not as an unsolved mystery anymore, but as the beginning of a story that took 20 years to reach its final chapter. Years after the trial ended and Daniel Mercer disappeared behind the heavy doors of a California state prison, the story of Emily Carter continued to live quietly in the memory of Santa Clara County. The headlines that once flashed across television screens eventually faded from the daily news cycle, replaced by newer crimes and newer mysteries. Yet some cases never truly disappear from a community's collective memory. They linger in conversations, in quiet reflections, in the small moments when someone remembers exactly where they were when the story first unfolded. For the residents of Willow Bend Drive, the memory remained tied to a single image that had once puzzled investigators and frightened neighbors: a car parked along the curb with the driver's door left open beneath the dim glow of a porch light. That ordinary object had become the first sign that something terrible had interrupted the life of a young teacher who had returned home from work expecting nothing more than another quiet evening. After the trial, Emily Carter's family held a private memorial service near the small cemetery where her remains were finally laid to rest. It was not a large ceremony. Only close relatives, a few friends, and several former students gathered beneath the shade of tall trees while a soft breeze moved through the grass. There were no cameras, no reporters, no breaking news banners announcing another development in the case. For the Carter family, that quiet moment was more meaningful than any headline. After 20 years of uncertainty, they could finally say goodbye to Emily in a place where her name would not disappear into an unsolved case file. Her parents spoke briefly during the service, thanking the investigators who had refused to let the case remain buried in the archives of the sheriff's office. They described the long years when hope felt fragile, when each anniversary of Emily's disappearance reopened the same painful questions. They spoke about the night in April of 2001 when they first realized their daughter had not returned home, a moment that seemed ordinary at first and then slowly transformed into a nightmare that stretched across decades. Many of the people standing nearby had once participated in the search efforts during those early days. They remembered walking through nearby parks, distributing flyers, and scanning roadside ditches with flashlights after sunset. Back then, the investigation had moved with urgency, driven by the belief that Emily might still be alive somewhere waiting to be found. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the search had gradually quieted until the case settled into the uneasy category known as a cold case. For detectives in Santa Clara County, the Carter investigation would forever remain one of the most powerful reminders that cold cases are never truly finished. The evidence that solved the crime had been present from the very beginning, preserved inside the door frame of Emily's car, where microscopic fibers carried the DNA of the man who approached her that evening. In 2001, the technology to analyze that evidence had not yet reached the level required to produce a clear genetic profile. The investigators who collected it could only store it carefully and hope that someday science might reveal what their tools could not yet see. That patience, combined with advances in forensic analysis nearly 2 decades later, eventually led detectives back to the truth hidden inside the Carter file. The case soon became a subject of study among law enforcement agencies across the country. Investigators examining other long-forgotten cases began reviewing evidence that had been stored for years in property rooms and forensic archives. The message from the Carter investigation was clear. Evidence, once considered insignificant, might hold the key to solving crimes that had remained unsolved for generations. Cold cases, by definition, carry a certain weight of time. Memories fade, witnesses move away, physical locations change. Entire neighborhoods can transform between the moment a crime occurs and the day detectives reopen the file decades later. Yet the Carter case proved that the passage of time does not always erase the possibility of justice. Sometimes it simply waits for the right moment. In the years that followed the trial, the Sheriff's Department established a dedicated cold case review team partly inspired by the success of the Carter investigation. Detectives began re-examining dozens of old files that had once been placed in storage, with little expectation of progress. Some of those cases produced new leads through modern forensic techniques, while others remained stubborn mysteries still waiting for their own breakthrough. But none of those investigations carried quite the same emotional impact as the story that began on Willowbend Drive. Occasionally, reporters returned to the neighborhood to film retrospective pieces about the case that had once captured national attention. They spoke with residents who remembered the shock of seeing police vehicles lined along the street that night in 2001. One neighbor described the uneasy feeling that followed the discovery of Emily's abandoned car, the moment when everyone realized that something had happened just steps away from the safety of her own front door. Another resident explained how the community had lived with that uncertainty for years, wondering whether the person responsible might still be living somewhere nearby. The answer, as it turned out, had been both unsettling and strangely simple. Daniel Mercer had indeed been close to the neighborhood that evening, working quietly on landscaping projects that allowed him to move unnoticed through suburban streets. His encounter with Emily Carter had begun as a brief moment that spiraled into violence and panic, a chain of decisions that led him to hide the crime rather than face the consequences. For 2 decades, he carried that secret while living an ordinary life, believing the past had been buried as deeply as the shallow grave he dug in a forgotten field. Yet the smallest details refused to disappear. A hair clip lodged beneath the seat of his truck. Microscopic fibers preserved in the frame of a car door. Fragments of evidence waiting patiently for the moment when technology and determination would bring them back into the light. Today, when people in Santa Clara County speak about the Carter case, they rarely focus on the violence of that April evening. Instead, they talk about the persistence that eventually uncovered the truth. They remember the investigators who reopened a file many others had quietly accepted as unsolvable. They remember the science that transformed a tiny genetic trace into the identity of a suspect who believed time had protected him. Most of all, they remember Emily Carter herself. Not only as the victim whose disappearance shocked a community, but as the teacher who once filled a classroom with stories, encouragement, and patience for students who needed someone to believe in them. The memory of that life remains far stronger than the crime that ended it. And in the quiet neighborhoods where the case began, the story continues to serve as a reminder that even the calmest streets can hold secrets beneath their surface. Secrets that may remain hidden for years, sometimes for decades, but not forever. Even after the conviction, long after the courtroom emptied and the television crews packed away their equipment, the story refused to fade quietly. For investigators who had spent years working in silence on forgotten files, the Carter case became something more than a solved murder. It became proof that time does not erase truth. It only buries it deeper, waiting for someone patient enough to dig. Inside the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department, A small room filled with gray filing cabinets held the silent weight of hundreds of other cold cases. Each drawer contained photographs, witness statements, faded maps, and pieces of evidence sealed in plastic bags that had not been touched for years. Some files dated back to the 1980s, others even earlier. Names that once dominated local headlines had slowly slipped from public memory, but within those cabinets the stories remained frozen in time. Detective Laura Ramirez often returned to that room late in the evening when the office had grown quiet. The Carter investigation had changed the way she looked at those folders. Before the arrest of Daniel Mercer, many of the files felt like dead ends, cases where every lead had been exhausted. Now, they looked different. They looked unfinished. She began pulling boxes from the cabinets one by one, spreading the contents across a large metal table. Photographs of crime scenes. Evidence logs written in handwriting that belonged to detectives who had long since retired. Old cassette recordings of interviews with witnesses whose voices sounded young and uncertain decades earlier. Every piece of evidence carried the same silent possibility. Somewhere inside the details, something had been missed. The Carter case had taught the department an uncomfortable lesson. For years, investigators believed they had done everything possible. They interviewed neighbors, checked phone records, examined Emily's car, and searched nearby fields. Yet the key to the entire case had been sitting quietly in an evidence locker, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. That realization spread beyond Santa Clara County. Law enforcement agencies across California began reviewing their own cold case archives with renewed urgency. Evidence that had once been considered too degraded or too small for analysis was suddenly re-examined with modern forensic tools. Laboratories that had once focused only on active investigations now reopened boxes that had been sealed for decades. The results were not always dramatic, but sometimes they were. In one nearby county, a 1993 homicide investigation produced a partial DNA profile that investigators had never been able to identify. Using the same genealogical techniques that helped solve the Carter case, analysts traced the genetic markers through distant relatives until they arrived at a suspect who had quietly moved out of state years earlier. That arrest made only a small ripple in the national news, but for the victim's family it meant the same thing the Carter case had meant. The long wait for answers was finally over. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer settled into the slow, silent routine of prison life. The man who once moved freely through suburban streets with a truck full of landscaping tools now spent his days within concrete walls and locked gates. Prison records later revealed that he rarely spoke about the crime. During interviews with correctional staff, he described the events of April 2001 as if they had happened to someone else, a distant story disconnected from the present. Yet investigators who reviewed the interrogation tapes remembered something different. They remembered the moment Mercer finally realized the evidence against him could not be explained away. The moment his voice dropped and his eyes shifted toward the table. That subtle change in posture told detectives more than any confession ever could. It was the quiet recognition that the secret he carried for 2 decades had finally caught up with him. Back in Willow Bend Drive, life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm after the media attention faded. Families continued to move in and out of the neighborhood. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks where police vehicles had once lined the street. The house where Emily Carter had lived eventually changed owners, and over time new residents learned the story that older neighbors still remembered clearly. Some people said the street felt different after the case was solved. For years there had been an invisible shadow hanging over the neighborhood, a lingering question about what really happened that night. Once the truth was revealed, the uncertainty disappeared, replaced by something quieter but more permanent, the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. Emily's former students were now adults scattered across the country. Many of them remembered the day their school first announced that their teacher was missing. At the time, they were too young to fully understand the seriousness of the situation. They only knew that the classroom suddenly felt empty without her calm voice guiding the lesson. When the arrest was announced nearly 20 years later, several of those former students contacted the Carter family. They shared memories of small moments from the classroom that had stayed with them through the years. One remembered how Emily stayed after school to help him understand a difficult math assignment. Another recalled the way she encouraged shy students to speak during discussions, patiently waiting until they found the confidence to answer. Those memories reminded the family that Emily's life had extended far beyond the tragedy that ended it. Her influence had continued quietly through the people she taught, long after the headlines faded. For investigators, the Carter case also changed how future crimes were documented. Evidence collection procedures became even more meticulous. Detectives were trained to preserve materials that might seem insignificant at the time, understanding that future technology might reveal their importance. A single fiber, a fragment of skin cells, a strand of hair, details that once seemed too small to matter could someday reopen a case thought to be closed forever. Years after the arrest, Detective Ramirez stood again in the cold case room surrounded by the silent files of unsolved crimes. She ran her fingers across the labels on the drawers, each one carrying the name of a victim whose story had paused somewhere in the past. She understood now that every case had its own timeline. Some moved quickly from crime scene to courtroom. Others waited quietly, sometimes for decades, until the moment when the right evidence, the right technology, and the right determination finally converged. The Carter case had waited 20 years. But it had never truly stopped moving forward. Somewhere inside those cabinets, other stories were still waiting for their moment. In the quiet years that followed the final court proceedings, the Carter case settled into a different kind of legacy. It was no longer a breaking headline or a courtroom drama unfolding in real time. Instead, it became something more enduring, a story passed quietly through law enforcement briefings, journalism retrospectives, and community conversations whenever the subject of cold cases surfaced again. The crime that had once terrified a peaceful Californian neighborhood now carried another meaning, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to remain buried. For the investigators who had lived through the long timeline of the case, the memory remained vivid. They remembered the first frantic days in April 2001 when patrol cars flooded Willowbend Drive and officers knocked on doors looking for witnesses who might have seen something unusual. They remembered the uneasy silence that followed when the search turned up nothing but unanswered questions. At the time, the disappearance of Emily Carter felt like a puzzle missing too many pieces. Every theory seemed possible, and yet none of them could be proven. The years that followed tested the patience of everyone involved. Detectives were reassigned to new cases. Evidence boxes were cataloged and placed in storage. New investigators joined the department who had never met Emily Carter and knew the case only through written reports. But even as time passed, the file remained intact, waiting quietly on a shelf like an unfinished sentence. Cold cases often carry a strange paradox. On the surface, they appear frozen in time, yet beneath that stillness, they continue to evolve. New technologies emerge, new investigative methods are developed, and sometimes even the smallest fragment of preserved evidence suddenly becomes meaningful in a way that earlier detectives could not have imagined. The Carter investigation followed that exact path. When the DNA breakthrough finally arrived nearly 2 decades later, it felt to many investigators as though the past had abruptly stepped back into the present. Detectives who had once believed the trail was gone forever suddenly found themselves examining old maps, rereading witness statements, and retracing the movements of people who had not been questioned since the early days of a case. What they discovered was both shocking and strangely simple. The truth had never been hidden by elaborate planning or criminal genius. Instead, it had been concealed by time, by ordinary routines, and by the assumption that certain pieces of evidence were too small to matter. Daniel Mercer had lived his life quietly during those years, working steady jobs, speaking politely with neighbors, appearing in every way like a man who carried no dark history. That ordinary image allowed him to blend into the background of daily life, while the investigation slowly cooled. To the outside world, he looked like someone who had nothing to hide. But the evidence remembered. A microscopic trace preserved in a laboratory vault waited patiently for technology to catch up. When that moment arrived, the truth that had remained silent for 20 years suddenly spoke with absolute clarity. For the Carter family, the arrest and conviction did not erase the grief they had carried since the night Emily disappeared. Loss of that kind leaves a permanent space in the lives of those left behind. Yet the resolution of the case provided something that had been missing for nearly 2 decades: certainty. The endless speculation about what might have happened was finally replaced by a clear understanding of how their daughter's life had been taken. They no longer had to live with unanswered questions. In the years since the case was solved, the story has been revisited many times in documentaries, podcasts, and investigative articles examining the evolution of forensic science. Each retelling focuses on the same haunting theme: the idea that justice can sometimes move slowly, but it does not always disappear. Cold cases exist in a strange corner of the criminal justice system. They are reminders of moments when the truth slipped through investigators' hands, when witnesses vanished or evidence proved too weak to support an arrest. For families of victims, those cases can feel like wounds that never fully close. Yet every solved cold case sends a powerful message to both investigators and criminals alike. Time is not always an ally. Every year, forensic science advances further. Techniques that were impossible decades ago are now routine. DNA analysis continues to improve. Digital databases expand. Genetic genealogy opens investigative doors that once seemed permanently sealed. The tools available to detectives grow stronger with every passing year. The Carter investigation became one of the examples cited by forensic specialists when explaining why evidence must always be preserved with extreme care. Something that appears meaningless today might become the key to a future breakthrough. That lesson now shapes the way new cases are handled across many departments. Detectives are trained to treat even the smallest trace as potentially valuable. Evidence lockers hold materials that might not be examined for years, but are protected with the understanding that tomorrow's technology may reveal their secrets. In Santa Clara County, the memory of Emily Carter continues to live in quieter ways as well. A small scholarship fund was established in her name to support students pursuing careers in education. Each year, a new recipient learns about the teacher whose life inspired the program. For many of those students, the story serves as a reminder of how one person's kindness in a classroom can leave an impact that lasts far beyond a single school year. Neighbors who once lived on Willow Bend Drive still remember the night the police first arrived. Some recall standing on their porches watching flashing lights reflect off the windows of parked cars. Others remember the uneasy conversations that spread through the community as word circulated that a young woman had vanished only steps from her own front door. For a long time, the street carried that memory like a shadow. But the day the arrest was announced, something changed. The mystery that had haunted the neighborhood for nearly 20 years finally had an ending. Not a happy ending, not a story that could undo the tragedy, but an ending that replaced fear and speculation with truth. Today, the houses along Willow Bend Drive look much the same as they did decades ago. Lawns are trimmed, children play outside, and evening lights glow softly from living room windows. To someone passing through the neighborhood, nothing appears unusual. It looks like any other quiet California street. Yet beneath that calm surface lies the memory of a story that once shook the entire community. A mysterious disappearance. A long and silent investigation. A cold case that refused to remain frozen forever. And somewhere in the archives of the sheriff's department, the Carter file now rests in a different drawer than it once did. No longer labeled unsolved. No longer waiting for answers. Instead, it stands as a reminder that even the most stubborn mysteries can eventually yield to persistence, science, and time. Because some truths may sleep for years, but eventually they wake.